there's going to be a lot of discussion along the lines of volatility and risk, unsurprisingly. And I've been pondering it a little bit. You know, what does that mean in this day and age? Macro uncertainty, low chances of Fed interest rate cuts, geopolitical risks, trade tensions, etc. Sticky inflation because the latest US figures came in worse than expected. Those sorts of things are the things that are coming out in the commentaries about the VIX. Those have settled things down from April spikes to a moderate but reactive volatility regime with the VIX trading between 15 to 22. And then reading that, we're meant to think about, okay, well, when was the last time things were like this? And we think, you know, uncertainty about the Fed and trade tensions with China, that sort of mirrored in 2015, 2016 the volatility at the time, which although lower than the present, was caused by an expectation of rising rates, yuan devaluation, and US-China trade tensions. And you could describe it now as sort of a slow grind volatility. And we could be talking about, should we be applying Garch or should we be looking at Heston in this kind of situation? Should we be looking at Sabre? Should we be looking at local vol models? Should we be looking at machine learning? Should we be looking at implied volatility surface models and all of that? But, after thinking about that and all of that sort of thing, the question just comes to mind, really, why are we talking about volatility at
Yeah,
all?
that's a very good question. Why are we talking about volatility models, really?
Yeah.
Because there's so many. Well, I don't know. This is just age or something, but it seemed like things were so much simpler, a few decades or fractions of a century ago. There are so many of these big picture things happening which could change, well, the future of mankind. So whereas the models for volatility that we're used to kind of assume that they don't exactly assume that the future will be the same as the past, but there's a strong element of that. So yeah, it does feel that it's a bit futile to be working with volatility or anything quantitative that makes too many assumptions about the nature of the modeling. The thing that springs to mind is people seem to want to have more and more complicated volatility models. And is that just giving us a false sense of security when,
Mm.
then why are we bothering when? Yeah, I hear people talk about what the 1960s and the fear of nuclear war, that people would disappear to the Canaries or something to save themselves from nuclear war. This is kind of our 1960s now with all of AI and nuclear war and pandemics. So yeah, why are we bothering? I mean, it's all about risk, isn't it? Risk is the big thing, but modeling risk in this situation, I don't know. I don't know.
Well, I mean, harking back, it perhaps for a start, it seemed a lot simpler before before we had super fast GPUs and all of this processing power. Maybe it seemed a little bit simpler because in the first place, all you were trying to do was just figure out what the volatility was that was implied when you're trying to work out an option, and there was a simplicity in that, and the methodology, the methods that were available were um, tractable. I mean, they were. It was the discipline that was the discipline that was involved in developing the formulas and a lack of processing power and all of that sort of thing created a sort of it was easily definable what the restrictions were and how far you could think. So as a result, perhaps what you were willing to accept in order to be able to insert yourself into the market and play the game is,
Yeah.
but things have changed. I mean, is there anything true in what I've said about the way things were before massive amounts of compute power for a start, when considering the problem of volatility.
Well, that probably applies to almost everything because of machine learning and artificial intelligence. It does feel like any sort of deep understanding has been replaced by deep learning. I just made that up. The yeah, when I say deep understanding, the creativity. For example, if you're using machine learning, artificial intelligence to do your volatility modeling or do anything in options, so suppose we had all the machine learning 50 years ago, would anyone have come up with the concept of delta hedging? Would you, is that's sort of the creative bit within options, is the idea that you can, under certain set of assumptions, you can hedge away all risk. Now, maybe artificial intelligence would be smart enough to sort of come up with that idea, but it would be somewhere in the algorithm. You wouldn't actually know that that's what it was doing. I keep banging on about fluid mechanics and the Navier-Stokes equation and Euler equations. The idea that there are essentially two sets of equations in fluid mechanics, but if you try and hit fluid flow problem with neural network, would it discover conservation of mass and conservation of momentum? Would that be somewhere inside the black box, the algorithm? Would it discover it? But the humans would never know about that, because the machine would not be able to say, well, it would have trillion parameters like these neural networks do these days. How could the machine tell you, well, actually, we got these trillion parameters, but actually only two of them are physically important: volatility and density. The rest are just geometry.
Right.
Anyway, I'm rambling as always.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a useful ramble because it seemed like it seemed like when you roped me into this whole thing that I'd never heard about, which was quantitative finance, it seemed like volatility models were where it's at. And obviously that was a part of something to do with the time. I mean, it was pre 2008. It was all about exotic structured products and all of that sort of thing. And certainly regulations weren't as tight as they are now. But in terms of well, at that time it was Sabre, published in the first issue of the magazine, and the discussion and the concentration on volatility models and research in that area, it was very vibrant. I mean, but now, related to what you're saying about machine learning and the fact that it's there, it seems at the end of the day, the VIX is basically a compilation of uh, of of implied volatilities from a whole bunch of different options, which are being affected by the underlying, which in itself, the underlying is being affected by multiple inputs and vagaries. And to throw something with a huge amount of compute power and access to all sorts of data should be able to figure out what the sort of the parameters of the variance are likely to be, and do it in real time and all of that sort of thing. So you would kind of think, okay, well, volatility is a thing that we can't really say very much about because we're only interested in the kind of volatility that hasn't happened yet. And therefore, all we can do is make our best guess so that we can actually insert ourselves in the market and play along and trade at a level which hopefully we're going to take advantage of in comparison to our counterpart. So, is it kind of like history's dead. There's no point having a volatility model or a discussion about that anymore. And it doesn't matter how much compute power you're wasting or whether any irrelevant parameters are being drawn in. If the result is that we can get just as good a handle on it as we did with when we were working with PDEs and so on and so forth.
Right. It's all about marketing. It's always about marketing. That's all it is. That's the whole point of everything is marketing, and you need to keep up to date with the latest trendy thing, whether it's high frequency something or it's machine learning. You can't get. It seems you probably can't get by making the simple assumptions, even though the simple assumptions might be just as good as or better than the more complicated ones. Which is kind of sad. I've just noticed in the question and answer, somebody says, you're not coming around to Nassim Nicholas Taleb's point of view, are you? It says an anonymous attendee in the Q&A thing. Look, Sunshine, I don't know who you are, anonymous attendee, but I taught Nassim Nicholas Taleb everything he knows.
And I was there when he did it.
Yeah, oh, yes. So, yeah, so many other questions here.
I'm still here. I'm just turning off my
Oh, one of your many cats has arrived.
one of them switched on the air purifier. I think it's allergic to me, so it switched it on.
It is fascinating that and this has been my experience for, in practice is that you've got to be coming up with new things to stay. I wanted to say relevant, but that's to stay popular. This is where I burst into song. You want to be popular, um, you've got to defy gravity, and but don't be wicked in doing so. No, it's yeah, volatility is fascinating from a quant perspective because we know from the Black-Scholes concept of hedging that we don't care about which direction stocks are going. Hence, we
Yeah.
always talk about volatility and risk. There's probably conferences happening now where nobody cares about volatility. They just want to know, are we in a bull market, a bear market, or going sideways? Yeah, we should all get together, really. Yeah, actually, from my own research in these fields, are in terms of volatility, I've always found it most interesting when you can't do hedging, or when the concept of hedging doesn't work for some reason to do with your model. And I find that a lot more fascinating because that brings back in the whole concept of directionality comes into the which direction the markets are going if you can't hedge. And I love that because that really annoys people because they're so used to not having this mu parameter, this drift rate in their models, that when I say, well, actually, it is there for I can give you a dozen different reasons off the top of my head why it is there in reality. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean the for me being a total non-quant, as everybody knows, but to me the regime switching sort of idea was always the one that's kind of like made sense to me
Yeah.
looking from the outside, and okay, so you handle things with jumps and
Yeah.
diffusion and all of that stuff, and that kind of like made sense to me. But it's not a sort of a panacea, is it? In any way, you can disabuse me of that that idea, if you like, when it comes to thinking about volatility, whether regime switching models are kind of all that, like I kind of feel like they are.
Yeah, no, I like those, but that's getting dangerously close to statistics, which I know nothing
Yeah,
about. I've tried to learn these things, but it's yeah, um, yeah, I like regime shifting things a lot, but knowing when you know which regime you're in, that's the question, isn't it? Yeah,
yes, yeah, exactly. So, all right. So if if I wanted to if I wanted to get rich off of volatility, what would your advice be to me now?
Yeah,
Can I
this is
still
something.
do that? Can I still do that?
I would assume so. I would assume so. The yes, well, several things. For as long as I can remember, I've been complaining that whenever you open a quant finance book, that it never tells you how to make money. In fact, usually the basic underlying assumption is no arbitrage. In fact, you can't make money.
Mm,
Unless it's maybe, well, I was going to say by publishing books, but even that's not possible anymore. So that's kind of strange. You occasionally get books which talk about how to make money, but they're not quantitative at all. So if you Google volatility, you'll find 10,000 papers on models where they're calibrating to implied volatility, and you'll get a handful of papers on how to exploit your volatility forecast versus somebody else's volatility forecast. And that's what I used to do in the old days. And we always worked with just the simplest of volatility models. And we would just forecast what we thought actual volatility was going to be and compare it with implied volatility, and we'd buy or sell. Usually sell. Um,
why was
the
that?
oh this that's going back to my hedge fund days, which is now a long time ago. That actually that reminds me of the thing David Orrell has been doing with his Q variance model,
Mm,
which I could talk about. It's kind of funny. He came up with this model, which, as I say, we can talk a little bit about, and he wanted to try it out in practice. And so he asked me for some money, just a small amount of money to put into a pot with his money, and to buy, to trade options. But the condition was he would only be buying options. He wouldn't be going short any options. That's what I said to him. If I'm going to,
okay.
there's going to be no chance of us, losing the house just because you sold a few options. So he started this a few months ago, and I explicitly said to him, "You must not tell me how you are doing because I want to be happy." I wrote about this,
Right.
not long
Yes,
ago.
yes.
I don't want to
Don't
see.
check your account all the time.
Don't keep telling me how much you've made or lost, okay? Because it'll just be depressing. Anyway, he accidentally told me a few months ago, and it was quite encouraging because he hadn't lost very much. Now that doesn't sound
Okay.
very positive, but in my experience, it was easier to make money by selling options. I think historically, I found that two-thirds of the time you would be selling options, one-third of the time buying options. So the fact that he was restricted to only ever buying options, and yet he was not losing too much, I thought that was very encouraging for this Q variance model.
Right.
Understand quantum stuff. There's so many things I don't understand, but it's based on a quantum idea. And it was one of these
Well,
strange things that does not seem to happen in finance, and that is
yes.
he came up with a model, and this just pure thought, and this model made some strange prediction about volatility and return. Something to do with the scale. You measure the volatility over some time period, you scale
Well,
it.
I've got the abstract here actually because we're putting the final touches on that for the July issue.
Yes,
Why
yes,
don't I read the abstract out,
yeah,
and
go
then
on.
you can tell us why this is so weird
Yes,
and maybe something we should be getting excited about. So David Orrell, he's got this paper which will be out in the July edition of Wilmott magazine. It's titled "A Quantum of Variance and the Challenge for Finance." Nice little nod to Bond there, I think, maybe as well. So he says Q variance refers to a property of asset price behavior where the expected variance over a period is related to price change over the same period by a simple quadratic equation whose only parameter is a base volatility. The property was first predicted using a quantum oscillator model. The Q can stand for quadratic or quantum, but has been demonstrated empirically for a range of asset types. This paper focuses on the consequences of Q variance for topics including asset price modeling, implied volatility, and the estimation of risk. It argues that while classical finance provides a reasonable approximation to some aspects of market behavior, Q variance means that it breaks down when used to estimate volatility. So a new approach is called for. And then you've done this dialogue with David, the meeting of two worlds as it was, and we're reaching out to get input, basically, right? So tell us the whole story on that one, Paul.
Yeah, so yes, it's exactly that. He had this model. The model made some prediction, and then he got some data, and he
Yeah,
found that the prediction was right, or it matched the data, which is odd, right? Usually in finance, what we do is we look at the data, think, oh, see some strange phenomenon. Let's make up some mathematics that might capture it. He did it the other way around. It's
yeah,
like Einstein and distortion of things around the planets, whatever. Finally, he tested. Then what it says is that you take a variance over some time period, scale it suitably, and look at the return over that same period and scale it suitably. And he found this relationship. Now, two strange things. One, if it's just ordinary diffusion, then there isn't any relationship between the variance and where the stock ends up.
right.
There are some models where you get the relationship between the variance and where the stock ends up are related, like jump diffusion. If you have jumps. But the thing about jump diffusion is that if you look over a long time period, then everything becomes normal again or log normal again. What he found was that in the actual data, this relationship stayed whatever time period you were looking at. Things didn't collapse down to normal. So that's strange, and it's been difficult finding any classical model that has this behavior.
Yeah, there's
All
something
right,
kind
so
of fractal about it, isn't it?
there's probably
Whatever.
something like that, but there's also he mentions that idea of a parameter. Now, normally, we come up with some model, stochastic volatility, and it's got loads of parameters, or we even make them time dependent for calibration purposes. He had in his model essentially he had a quadratic curve for this relationship between variance and return. This quadratic curve, and the only parameter was the levels, so how high up and down it was. The quadratic bit was 1/2 return squared, always 1/2. And he looks at data for
Right.
all sorts of indices and all sorts of things. It's always 1/2. It's not lambda return squared. It's always 1/2. No, I said I'm not a statistician, but I wondered whether this was some statistical phenomenon that actually it's not real, but somehow with his scaling or his measurement, something he did means that he's inadvertently found this relationship which isn't really there. So lots of strange things. He sent it to several experts to look at, and I've sent it to experts to look at, and nobody has seen this before. Nobody can explain it. Some people haven't actually replied. I won't name any names. Some well-known people haven't replied. So we're just kind of keen to see whether this is a real thing or not. Real phenomenon. Or, we could be talking complete nonsense, but it would be nice to know that we're talking complete nonsense. So there'll be people out there can tell us whether this is nonsense, whether it's some statistical phenomenon, whether it's well known in the literature or what. But I'm just curious.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, once the issue's published, which will be we're going to print next week, actually, fingers
Right.
crossed, and it'll be out in July. It'll be online before that, no doubt.
Yeah.
And hopefully we can get some discussion going on in the forum. And in the meantime, out to the audience here, because I think we've got a couple of hundred people listening in. If you've if that's kind of sparked something, let us know. Just drop an email into wilmott.com or and let us know your thoughts on that, because
Yeah.
this quantum thing is that's the thing that is very interesting. I mean, we've actually kind of given a space to quantum related stuff for quite a few years now, but
Yeah.
it's this toss up between, okay, quantum computing, massive amounts of power, incredible efficiency, and all of that sort of stuff if they can only get it down to the right temperature for the chip. Um, and there's that aspect of it, and all the hype, and it's going to, you know, uh, cryptocurrencies are going to be in a hell of a lot of trouble because quantum is just going to, you can chuck a quantum computer at anything and it'll solve it in milliseconds. There's that aspect of it, but then the other aspect of it is the one that David is very much on about, which is basically um, we're in a position now to think in a non-classical way about finance,
Yeah.
and and this particular paper and this particular discussion that you're having seems like the first sort of thing that we can actually sort of get to grips with and say, okay, there really may be something here.
Possibly. Or it could turn out to be rubbish.
Well, of course, that's always the case when there really may be something here, but
Yeah.
yes, exactly. So it'll be interesting to see. It'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. But certainly, we know where David stands.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but as I say, in terms of how we how we think about volatility, um, and what it means in the financial markets, there probably isn't very much left to say. Do you think?
Um, well, what will people talk about if they're not going to talk about volatility? Um, yeah, that people are not talking about exotic options. That was great fun for a while. Yeah, what are people going to talk about in finance terms?
Well, I hear that structured products are making a bit of a comeback in
Okay.
Asia somehow or other, but obviously the markets are somewhat differently regulated out here. So we're not necessarily going to see a similar amount of wild westery as we did back in the 80s and 90s, in the last millennium. But at the same time, one interesting question would be, the markets didn't have to deal with the fact that there were competing alternative markets like cryptos and all of that sort of stuff. That was one thing that we had. We didn't have any problems with. We had a sort of a singular point of focus previously, but now we don't. There are many competing things for our attention,
Hmm.
and the applicability of what we've learned or what we applied in terms of volatility to the financial markets over the last 50 years. Um, what bits of that do you think are transferable and useful? And what bits of that are very much an aspect of the marketplaces to which they have been applied? So it's sort of,
Right. Yeah.
what's useful that you can take away from this, and what's kind of should be in your brain when
Yeah.
you're thinking about this problem, as
Yeah.
opposed to what worked previously.
Yes. Good question. It's well, as a mathematician, yeah, what would I move if I were younger? What would I move on to instead of quant finance? Um, that's a good question. I don't know. Maybe the dinosaurs like me, there's nowhere for us because everything is programming or artificial intelligence. Maybe there's nowhere for us to go. That's quite possible. It's a bit depressing. I would think it may be outside finance, completely outside finance. Would it be economics? That'd be brilliant. Actually, there's I don't know how much role there is in economics for dinosaurs like me, but it is great to think that AI will definitely make economists and lawyers completely redundant. That's got to be good, right? We don't
Well,
need lawyers
yes,
anymore, you know.
no.
Not if we got AI, we have economists. Yeah, rather than making up stuff in some ivory tower that's got nothing, there's no relation to reality. The the AI will just look at all the data and it'll figure out stuff. Um, yeah, the interest.
Where do we, in terms of all of this good stuff that we had that was developed in a kind of analogy to physics and an analogy to the natural sciences and all of that sort of stuff, which served things very well. But there has been this huge change in terms of the tools that are available and so on. But yet the game is still exactly the same. It's just, you know, I'm sure that there are. I'm sure that there's sort of like a corollary in terms of sport or something like that, but I just can't think of it at the moment. But it's
It
kind
could
of
be.
it's yeah, go on.
I was going to say it could be that all scientists and medics and everything is going to be completely redundant. Everyone, yeah, what I find fascinating is that so many people are into programming, but for AI, etc. But at the same time, AI is making programmers redundant. So where is that going to end? And will programmers be, will they be ruling the earth, or will they be, because there's so many of them and they're now redundant, will they be left to, clean toilets or something? But, if one has children, should you be encouraging them to do computer programming or telling them to keep away from computer programming in a nutshell?
Yes, exactly. I mean, the question is sort of a case of, well, if we're going to move into sort of a prompt based uh, reality wherein the only competition that you can have with other people is whether you can come up with a better question,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Because that's the only thing that's going to differentiate things. If you're going to just plug it into an LLM, or you're going to plug it into, you know, how well can you define the problem?
Yeah. Well,
Okay, well
I've been,
that seems to match up in some ways with the old things, because it was about how well can you define the problem.
yeah, that's true. I just because we're running out of time, I should say I've been
Oh
experimenting
my
with
goodness.
some AI podcast thing, which where I can be completely replaced by some person speaking,
Mm.
so I don't need to be doing this. Not that I don't enjoy doing this, but I could be replaced. And I found I've been working with some very good software, but it's trying to capture my voice and my accent, and it's doing a really really bad job of it. It cannot get my slight northwestern accent correct at all. Every time I read out the script, I'm supposed to then learn the way I speak. It turns me into Richard Burton, and it makes me sound far more intelligent than I actually am. So I feel it's cheating somehow. I can't quite get the
Well,
Scouse vowel
at,
sounds.
at least you can say that you are the inimitable Paul Wilmott, and we can really, it's
Yes,
actually objectively proven. AI
yes,
can't even get it right.
that is a good point. That is a good point. Yes.
But again, to the audience, if you do have any pointers on how to get the AI to more accurately mimic your voice, I'm also looking forward to it because, if anybody sat through one of my painful podcasts previously, I could probably do with an AI replacement as well.
Well, I would tell everybody watch the Netflix series, the based in the UK. It's called The Capture. It's on season 2 now. If you want to be terrified about the future,
I will watch it after this. I
yeah.
think I'll prepare myself. Anyway, thank you very much for chatting with me. I think we quite successfully managed to uh, fill the time.